Good morning and welcome to this class. To consider today's question, what is the difference between postcolonial and decolonial sociolinguistics, I'd like you to think about Ache. Ache is a language spoken in Paraguay by about 200 people and probably no children speak it anymore. Linguists would probably classify it as critically endangered and would agree that language revitalization is urgent. Yet, I'd like you to consider what the linguistic anthropologist Jan David Hauk says about the Ache language. The Ache language is not something that once was there and is now almost gone. On the contrary, it has now just arrived. I argue that before contact and settlement, there was no such thing as the Ache language. Now, what's interesting to us is that the Ache live in a post-colonial setting. Paraguay has been independent since 1813, yet colonial structures, including about language, still very much organize life in Paraguay. Hauk's statement invites us to question the coloniality that pervades sociolinguistics today. Like today's question, this statement invites us to question how sociolinguistics could engage with different linguistic practices and ways of knowing the world or epistemologies. To answer today's question and to understand what Hauk means, we'll need to discuss a few essential concepts: coloniality, racialism, and epistemology. But first, I'll need to take you on a short historical detour to understand what modernity is as a historical period. This is important because this is what postcolonial and decolonial approaches engage with. After that, I'll take you through the main differences between both approaches in sociology and cultural studies, and that will take us straight to language. And finally, I'll be asking you to tell me how you understood Hauk's statement based on what we said in this class. So, to put it simply, postcolonial and decolonial approaches are forms of critical theory that question the main assumptions of modernity. Like all theories, they're concerned with emancipation. Now, modernity is a period that dates back to the 17th century and is associated with the development of rationality, modern science, and the modern state. The cornerstones of modernity are perhaps decontextualization, the idea that foundations of modernity are not linked to a particular place or people, and universalism, the fact that those ideas can apply everywhere. Science, it means that your results do not depend on whether you're Protestant, Catholic, white, black, etc. Politics, this means that if your argument is rational, who you are, where you come from, doesn't make your argument less rational. Note that the idea of standard languages as a neutral means of communication also comes from there. So what postcolonial and decolonial projects do is actually to recontextualize knowledge, politics, and language, to expose their conditions of production, to show that under the mask of universality, European science and politics represented very much the values of a small group of individuals who were wealthy, male, white, and who spoke a major European language. For postcolonial and decolonial thinkers, racialism, codification of color as race, and the hierarchization of races is a central concept of modernity. In fact, according to the Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano, the idea of race is without a doubt the most efficient instrument of social domination to be invented in the past 500 years. Quijano adds that race was particularly powerful as a tool for domination because it was presented as a fact of nature, something that had nothing to do with the history of colonial power between colonized and colonizers. Now, this is where postcolonial and decolonial approaches differ. They're both concerned with race, but for decolonial thinkers, race is the primary lens for analysis. On the other hand, postcolonial approaches are often rooted in Marxism, and for them the most salient analytical tool might be social class, struggle between workers and the bourgeoisie. As a consequence, both approaches treat coloniality from a slightly different angle. Postcolonialism might be concerned with history of colonialism and struggles for decolonization. On the other hand, decoloniality will pay much attention to epistemology. Where is knowledge produced and by whom? How are indigenous forms of knowledge appropriated and invalidated? How does coloniality of knowledge continue even after national independence? Just to give you one example of coloniality of knowledge, look at how indigenous languages are often considered important in Western media because they contain information about medicinal plants. Now, linguistics was always a crucial component of the coloniality project. Social linguistics did try to critique that from the start. This book, for example, from 1974, critiqued the way that linguistics had described languages and communities in the colonies. But the formalization of postcolonial social linguistics is a lot more recent. A journal of postcolonial linguistics was founded in 2019. And for them, the term postcolonial is actually an umbrella term for both postcolonial and decolonial approaches. What I found interesting is how the journal editors view the differences between both approaches. The aim that binds together postcolonial linguistics forms a double commitment: to study language and linguistic practices in postcolonial contexts and to engage critically with the way in which we do linguistics. Some studies will emphasize the first agenda and others the second, and most will have something to say about both. In other words, how decolonial the postcolonial linguist is tends to correspond to how much the second aim is emphasized. This is particularly useful to distinguish between different types of research questions. So let's come back to endangered languages, for example. The postcolonial question would aim, as Salikoko Mufwene writes, to reduce the Western bias and hegemony in how languages in the global South and the social linguistic behaviors of their speakers and writers are analyzed. But to engage with the decolonial agenda, we have to go further and to question some of the core assumptions of social linguistics. For one thing, we could question the very notion of a language. Does every culture think of language as a thing with a name, a grammar, a dictionary? In this sense, approaching linguistic practices through the lens of translanguaging, for example, a term that was invented to describe fluidity between speakers, languages, and repertoires, is a good place to start. But we could take decolonial social linguistics further, in particular in terms of taking into account indigenous epistemologies. Let's return to the case of the Ashe. Hauk's statement invites us to ask what speaking means for the Ashe. Who, or even what, is considered to be a legitimate participant in the interaction? Should language be restricted to human participants, as Western modernity prescribe? Or should we question the fact that in Aceh, Jawu is a term used for both human language and the buzzing of bees? What, in other words, would a social linguistics beyond the human look like from an Aceh perspective? What would that imply in terms of language policy? So to conclude this class, I'd like you to think about Hauk's quotation and to connect to a very short online quiz. Then you can check how you understood the quote after the class. And in the meantime, I thank you very much for listening and I wish you a very pleasant day.